Hello again and welcome to another Warhammer 40k Mordian Glory Tournament Report. Now for those of you who haven't watched one of these videos before, I'm going to do a very quick introduction. These videos are all about me going to a tournament, playing some games and then coming back and reporting on the findings. I tend to talk about things about like the competitive state of the game, what is the meta like, what's it feeling like out there on the competitive scene. I'll also do a review of the list that I've used. It's normally a guard list, and then what can be learned from that experience. Did it work, the list? Did it not work? What was good? What was bad? And so the whole purpose of this is for guard players, but also the general 40k community at large, to get a little bit of a peek into the tournament scene and get a bit of a feel for how the competitive meta is out there. What can you expect to come across when you go to an event? How cutthroat is it? What's the general state of competitive 40k? So without further ado, let's crack on with today's video and let's go over the event itself. So the event I went to this weekend was a one-day RTT tournament and it was called Bring the Ruckus, and I just really like that name. It was organised by a group called Team Stonehammer and it was actually their first tournament. I got chatting to some of the TOs in between rounds, and I have to say, for a first event, it was really good. Very well organised. The pairings were done well ahead of time. Lists were all sorted out well ahead of time. Best Coast pairings app was used, and it was all just generally, I have to say, no fault with the organisation of the tournament whatsoever. It was, tour organisers were great at communicating pre and during the tournament and afterwards as well. So overall, really, top marks for organisation and effort put into the event. I want to say a massive thank you to Team Sohan for doing all that. It's not easy organising tournaments, and it's really easy to turn up and play at them, but I imagine there's a lot of work that goes in behind the scenes. So big thank you to them. I also want to say a big thank you to Element Games for hosting the event. Element Games is a pretty good venue. Most people have heard of them. If you haven't, they're one of the bigger sort of names in UK sort of 40k and wargaming in general. Really nice venue, and good parking, all that kind of stuff. And they've got a really big shop attached to it, and you can actually buy stuff online, or you can buy stuff in the shop, and it's all got a good discount code and all that kind of stuff. So I highly recommend to check it out. They've got massive stock. But without further ado, let's get into the nitty gritty of this video, and let's start off with the list. What did I take to the tournament? I took my standard competitive take all comers Scions list. This is a list which doesn't skew or anything like that. It just does a little bit of everything, and it is able to go into most games with a decent chance of having a good result. So the first part is there are two detachments, both of which are battalions and both of which are Lambdan Lions. The first battalion has 3 Taurox Primes. Each Taurox Prime has 2 5-man squads of Scions in it. Each one of those has double plasma and a plasma pistol and a chain sword. Okay, and also leading that detachment is 2 HQ choices. Both are Tempestor Primes. Both have command rod and chain sword. One of them has got a warlord trait via progeny of conflict, and he's also got a relic. And I take on him the keys to the armory trait. That's the Lambdan Lions one, which is a reroll to hit roll of 1 bubble within 6 inches. And it's also, I take the bubble shield generator, which is a 5+ invulnerable save to everyone within 6 inches as well. That is pretty standard loadout for Lambdan Lions. That detachment is what I would call a standard competitive core of any Scions list that you're going to be coming across. You want at least 3 Tauroxes, and you want them loaded out with plasma, and you want them Lambdan Lions. It's a good time. Now, the other detachment has got some more manoeuvrability in it, and in this detachment I have 2 Valkyries. In those Valkyries I have 1 big 10-man squad with 4 Melta guns in it and a plasma pistol and a chainsword on the sergeant. In there goes my warlord, which is my Lord Commissar, and he has the warlord trait Master of Command, which allows him to issue an order. So that's why I take a 10-man squad, because he can only do 1 order, but at least he can order the full 10 man. I used to actually take 2 5-man squads in there, but I kept finding that I was only issuing 1 order, and so even though I was getting an extra free plasma pistol on the sergeant, I wasn't boosting that plasma pistol and 2 Melta guns. So now I basically have 1 less plasma pistol, but I have a big 10-man squad, and they all get an order, which is much better. In the other Valkyrie, I do have 2 5-man squads. They've both got double Melta gun and a plasma pistol, chainsword on the sergeant, and they have a Tempestor Prime which rock around with them. The purpose of these guys, in theory, is to allow me to fly forward, drop down, and melt something using the precision drop stratagem. We'll get into that a little bit as the video goes on. Last thing to say is I have 2 other squads. One is a basic squad with just, hotshot las rifles and a free plasma pistol sergeant, and the other one is basically the same, but I had 10 points left over, so I gave them double volley gun as well. Those squads are designed for dropping down, getting retrieve victorious data, getting me some engaged points, and generally having a good time. Last but certainly not least, I have some auxiliary support. I have a big squad of 9 Bullgryn. And these guys have got 6 Slabshields and they've got 3 Brute Shields, which means I've got lots of saves going all over the place. Supporting them, I have a Priest, which gives them lots of extra attacks. And I also have an Inquisitor. Now, the Inquisitor is primarily there to help me operate in the psychic phase. He is what I call a double Smite Inquisitor. He actually only does Smite once because, that's legal, but he does have an Inquisition-specific pseudo-Smite called Castigation, which I sort of nicknamed Castration because I think it's funnier. And that is another way of being able to do mortal wounds. How that power works is you roll the dice. I think it's Warp Charge 5. If you get it off, then you roll 3d6. If you beat the enemy's leadership, which you nearly always do, then you do an additional d3 mortal wounds. But it is targetable. But you tend to do it at the nearest target anyway because you try and stack those mortal wounds on top of, with Smite. So that is the list. It is able to operate in all stages of the game. It's got maneuverability from those Valkyries and those Tauroxes. It's got firepower from those Tauroxes and the plasma guys, and it's got turn 1 Alpha Strike potential with the guys dropping out the Valkyries. So it can move, it can shoot, and it can fight because I've got the Bullgryns, and it can do, most importantly, just a smidge of mortal wounds in the psychic phase. And the reason it's important that I want to be able to operate in every phase is in case I come across something like a Void Dragon or Ghazghkull, something which can only take a certain number of wounds per phase. I want to be able to do some wounds in the shooting phase, a little bit of wounds in the psychic phase, and a little bit of wounds in the combat phase. As you can see, it's very much a take-all-comers army. It doesn't overly skew into any one thing. It's not got ridiculous amounts of infantry. It's not got ridiculous amounts of combat. It's got it's got a mech element. It's got a mobile element. It's got a combat element. So I know I can take, even though it's not the best Scions list out there, I know that I can take this list into any engagement, and I don't have to, be too worried about what I'm going to face because I know I'll be able to operate. I'll be able to do something. Okay. However, I will say that I have learned some lessons from this list, and I think I am going to be specialising it a little bit more because Scions aren't take-all-comers at the end of the day. But without further ado, that is the list. That's the tournament introduction. Let's get into the first game. So here we are, game 1 of the event. Now, my first opponent was Blood Angels, and he had what I would call a pretty standard take-all-comers Blood Angels list. Very combat-orientated, really lent into his doctrine. Off the top of my head, his list was a big unit of Death Company with some Thunderhammers in there, a big unit of Sanguinary Guard. When I say big, we're talking like maxed out here, guys. He also had some Outriders, some Eradicators, a squad of 3 of each, and then there was a whole bunch of troops. So we had multiple squads of Incursors, I believe they're called, as well as a squad of Assault Intercessors. On top of that, he had a squad of Eliminators and a Vindicare Assassin. Now, I'm sure there were a few other bits around as well. But he then had quite a lot of buffing characters. We're talking Dante, Sanguinary Priest, Chaplain on Bike, another character with a jump pack, but he used that to hold an objective for a lot of the game. But yeah, that was generally the list. So a lot of infantry, and all of it Primaris, with some good supporting characters, and then some Death Company and some Sanguinary Guard. So to give you a quick idea of deployment, I put a Valkyrie in each corner. I put a Taurox Prime in the little mini ruin that's in the middle here. This picture's taken from my perspective of the battlefield. And then I put 2 Taurox Primes and the Bullgryns in the big ruin on the right. My opponent had his like Eradicators and his Outriders and his Sanguinary Guard in reserve. And then he had his Eliminators and Vindicare and Death Company in the big ruin on the left hand side from this perspective, and then he had a bunch of incursors in the big ruin on the right, and he also infiltrated some forward as well, and then he had his supporting characters, Assault Incessor, sort of in the middle of his deployment zone. Now my opponent did get the dice to go first, and he boosted forward using Forlorn Fury or whatever it's called now. Then he moved again. He was actually able to get a turn 1 charge on one of my Valkyries, and he did kill it. But unfortunately for my opponent, he didn't roll a very long charge, and he had the conga line, so he wasn't able to wrap and trap, so the infantry were able to spill out, and that meant the big squad of guys with Melta guns, with the Commissar, spilled out of the of that Valkyrie. But that was pretty much it for my opponent's turn 1. One thing I know from Blood Angels is that they'll tend to get a really good turn 1, turn 2, and if you can survive that, then you can tend to grind them down, and that was very much my game. So then my turn 1 comes around, and I'm like, right, I want to play a little cagey. So I drop my other Valkyrie into hover mode, and I bring it over so it's in range, because if I put it into hover mode it gets +1 to hit, and I bring it over to support the Scions that got blown out of the other Valkyrie, and it's got line of sight on those Death Company. I then also use my Bullgryns to screen, and one of the Taurox Primes to screen out that big ruin, because I know he's going to have Eradicators, he's going to have Outriders, he's going to have Sanguinary Guard. They're all going to want to come in and do horrible things to me. I don't know if he's going to bring them in turn 2 or turn 3, but I know he's got horrible things that he wants to do to me. So, what happened was my turn, I was with the squad that had been blown out of the Valkyrie, plus the remaining Valkyrie, I was able to do a lot of damage to Death Company. There's only 4 left after the dust has settled, but he did use 2 CP to auto pass them. I had, however, used the stratagem Hammerfall on them, which meant they could only move half and advance half and charge half. They weren't going anywhere, but to be fair, they just wanted to charge the Scions that were in front of them. I'd also killed some infiltrators in the middle of the board. But that was about it. You know, I dealt mostly with one threat, which was Death Company, and then I had also cleared out a bit of the middle of the board. His turn 2 comes round, and his Sanguinary Guard drop in, and his characters move forward, and basically what happens is. Basically what happens is his Sanguinary Guard and his and Dante go into the Bullgryn, and they kill all but 2 of them. I should say his Vindicare has like plinked off a couple of Bullgryn as well, but they go in. But the Bullgryn, I get quite lucky on the 4 pinballs, but there's still 2 Bullgryn left, and I use 2 CP to like auto pass them. Oh yeah, that's it. They're staying around. My turn 2 comes around, and I'm like, okay, the Death Company, the Death Company like munched most of the Melta squad as well, even though there's only 4 of them. But because there was only 4, and because Thunderhammer's a -1 to hit, it actually meant that there was still 3 Melta guns and a plasma pistol, or 2 Melta guns and a plasma pistol left over after the dust had settled. So yeah, I think I was able to, and I got lucky on their morale, and they just passed. So that was good. So then it came to my turn 2, and I was like, okay, the Death Company are contained, the Sanguinary Guard are stuck out in the open in front of Taurox Primes and Plasma. It's go time. And so the hatches open up, and the Scion Plasma Death comes rolling out. And the Valkyrie that still had 10 guys in it with Melta goes over to the middle of the board and basically this turn I delete, and I use precision drop on that Valkyrie. And I use precision drop to get in range of his characters. You see, behind the Sanguinary Guard was the Sanguinary Ancient and the Chaplain on bike, and then there was Dante and the Sanguinary Guard in front. And so basically, all the plasma and the Tauroxes and 2 Tauroxes open up into the Sanguinary Guard and Dante, and they all go down. The Inquisitor kills 2 with psychic powers, or 1 with psychic powers, kills 1 with psychic powers, I think. And then all the plasma and 2 Taurox Primes go into Sanguinary Guard and Dante. I've got real ones to hit, thanks to Keys to the Armory, and then I've got real ones to wound on all the plasma. It's all overcharged. And Sanguinary Guard are like only toughness 4. I've got loads of attacks, but and a 2-up save, but that gets put down to a 6-up save against Lambdan Lion Plasma. Look, the dust settled. All the Sanguinary Guard die. Dante dies. Back over on the Death Company, the Valkyrie, and the remaining guys with Melta guns and the Tempestor Prime are thanks to fall back and shoot with the order, are able to finish off the remaining few Death Company. And then the Sanguinary Guard are dead, and then Dante's dead, and then Salt in the Wound, because I precision dropped against his characters. I put 4 Melta guns and a plasma pistol with real ones to hit from the Commissar into his chaplain on bike, and I just kill him. Because I get like 2 Melta shots through, but I'm in Melta range, so it's like a minimum of 6 damage, and then I ended up rolling like something crazy, like 12 damage on the guy, and he just died. And then against the Sanguinary Ancient, I just shot Hotshot Lasguns at him, and he just died, but I think he did live. But that I had some spare firepower from, I think, the Taurox Prime that's nearest to the camera that you can see now. There's the one that's just in front, and I was able to draw a line of sight and just finish him off. But either way, I killed the Death Company, all his key characters, and the Sanguinary Guard, and my opponent was like, "Oh, that's what Scion firepower feels like." Because my first turn, you have to understand, he hadn't really felt it. He lost like a squad of infiltrators, and his Death Company had been a bit torn up, but not really. So he was going aggressive, but that turn sealed it. That was turn 2, that sealed it. To be fair, my opponent does try to keep himself in the game. You can see this is where the Scions and the Commissar dropped out, and he does bring his assault intercessors around the corner, and they just tear through the Scions like there's no tomorrow. But the Commissar manages to stay alive, because as you can see where I've wrapped him, they couldn't charge him. And they don't, and he wants to turn the jet, so my opponent doesn't like try and wrap and trap the Commissar. But yeah, that's the last hurrah for my opponent, unfortunately. Like I said, he brought his remaining reserves in turn 3. They blow up a Taurox Prime and kill some of their infantry, but that's it. And in return, I have a couple of squads of plasma and 2 Taurox Primes going against his reserves, the 3 squads of plasma, and they just die. I then have, I get really lucky. One of my squads had dropped in and rodded. He had ignored it because he didn't have anything special, and then they just ran up to him and just blasted him with hotshot las rifle shots and like killed like 2. I got really lucky. I just killed like 2 eliminators, like not what they're called, eradicators, with like a 5-man squad. To be fair, they did 4 wounds and 1 had already been a bit damaged, but yeah. And that was it. Turn 3, I wrapped it all up. Turn 4, I kill his remaining characters, and basically turn 5, I table him, and he had nothing. He couldn't do anything about it. And once the dust had settled, it was a really big win for the Scions, and I ended up getting 96 points to my opponent's like 48, I think it was, 40 or 50. It was a massive, massive win for the Scions. And the reason for that is simply that I knew my opponent's list inside and out. And because I've faced that kind of list time and time again. My opponent hadn't faced Scions really before. And yeah, it was just, that makes all the difference. Another thing I want to mention though is the terrain. And this will be a bit of a theme throughout the event. And if I had one criticism of the event, it would be the terrain, which in this case it benefited me. Whilst there was plenty of line of sight blocking in deployment zones, there was basically none. Basically very, very little line of sight blocking terrain in the middle of the board. And this is the case for every single game. And in this game it benefited me because my opponent was an assault army and he couldn't hide, and so I just got to gun him down wherever and whenever I wanted. And that was, I would say, the biggest factor. If my opponent had had lots of terrain to hide behind and around and in and all that kind of stuff, it would have made a huge difference. But in this case, the only line of sight blocking terrain in the middle of the board was those two bastions, and you can't really get inside those. They're not cover. You know, you can try and sort of sneak around them, but 40k models are big. 40k models are really big. So it's easy to get a little angle on something. And then, like I said, in this game, that really, really benefited me. So that was game one. Really, really strong start for the Scions, but bit of foreshadowing for you here, guys. Maybe too strong a start. Like Icarus, I had dared to fly close to the sun. And when you get a score like that, it means you're basically guaranteed to go on to table one, which was the case. I got the highest score of anyone round one from what the TOs told me. And that was scary. And it's a double-edged sword when you get that, because it means if you lose your game two, it means that even if you lose your game two, because you scored so highly game one, it means you're going to get a really tough game three. But if you can win your game two, then it starts putting you in position to win the tournament or to podium. So I'd gone out strong. The Scions had absolutely beasted a 9th edition codex, a Blood Angels army list that absolutely beasted it. But let's get into game two. So game two comes around and I'm on top table. And this is what it looked like. And so this is where I really want to just highlight the terrain thing again. I don't want to go on and on about it. But the only line of sight blocking bit of terrain really on this for table one was that big ruin in the centre. And the rest of it was open killing fields. And if I had been facing another assault army, that would have been real nice. But I wasn't facing another assault army. I was facing knights. Now, when some people will tell you, oh, knights aren't very good in 9th edition, that can be the case. But when someone has chosen to bring knights to a tournament and they're on table one and they've got 94 points in their first game, that's when you realise knights aren't bad. It just took a while for the community to figure out what worked. And so this was a knight list, and I don't know the exact ins and outs of it because it was quite well layered. But it was one of the big knights, the Castellans, Plasma, Gun, Volcano Lance. Two of the smaller knights, one Thermal, one and Gatling Cannon, one Battle Cannon and Gatling Cannon. They had Carapace missiles, and they, I believe, were House Raven, and they were taken with AdMech. And the AdMech stuff meant that the knights got bonuses to it as well. So the knights got the AdMech stuff as well, which is interesting. And then there was a smattering of Scutari and some of the Cerberus Raiders and a Scutari Marshal, stuff like that. So, yeah, and the knights were all tricked out with everything you could want. You know, we're talking Warlord traits, relics, all this kind of jazz. Now the problem is, and the mission was, I should say, what was the mission? The mission was sweep and clear. And I'm going to say this now. I lost this game. As in, I lost the game, but it was because of myself. I could have won this game. And you are good. And honestly, you learn so much more from your mistakes than you do from your victories, guys. Okay. You see, the game was pretty close, actually. I won't go through the turn-by-turn breakdown. In terms of objectives, my opponent took like engage, and he took some banners, and he took priority objective, which is the one in the middle. And I took retrieval ties data, and I took engage, and then I took Titan Slayer. And in retrospect, that was entirely the wrong thing to take. Because yes, I would get points for killing knights. But those knights are really, really hard to kill. And even though I do have elimination protocol sanctioned, my opponent has just enough to screen me out. And my strength caps out at strength 8. Which means at best I'm wounding these guys on 4s. Which makes it actually really difficult for me to kill them, because all it takes is a couple of bit of cold luck on my side, and a bit of lucky 4+ vulnerable saves on his side, and yeah, and I can drop in and kill a knight, but I don't have the durability or the terrain to hide behind in order to survive the counter punch. So it was very difficult. It actually was a very difficult matchup, and I lost it by, firstly, I took Titan Slayer. And I should have taken priority objective. And the second reason I lost it was because, and I have made this mistake in every single game at this tournament, I always forget to rod turn 1. And in this game, I forgot to rod turn 1 and rod turn 2. Which meant I only got, by the time the dust settled, I only managed to get rod off, I think, twice. I got almost no points for it. Almost no points for it. Absolute idiot. And I only ended up killing one of the knights. And what's so frustrating is, you guys are going to absolutely kill me. I killed one of the knights, and it was interesting how easily I was able to kill one. Basically, my opponent brought one of his knights too far forward, and so I was actually able to use a knight like blocking terrain to kill it and have a bit of protection, but I could only do that once. A little bit of a mistake on my opponent's part, I would say. But to give you an idea of how, so I forgot to rod basically, and that cost me. And then I sat on the middle objective of the Bullgryn Bomb pretty much the whole game to deny my opponent his primary. But if I had had priority, I would have got so many points on it. And the end result, when we totted the points up, my opponent won by 1 point. 1 point. If I had just rodded, I could have done it. But here's the thing. I made a mistake in one of my turns. I went to rod. I moved one of my one of these stupid things, and I moved one of my Scions Squad. It was just a one-man Scions Squad that was left over, and I moved him, and without thinking, because I was like, I'm going to rod with him, I moved him and I advanced him, and I went, oh, I didn't mean to advance him. I didn't, just didn't think. I didn't need to advance him. I'd rolled the dice, but went, oh, I didn't need to advance him. He was just going to rod, and my opponent went, well, you've rolled the dice. And I was like, yeah, but I didn't need to get the rod. And my opponent went, but you've rolled the dice. And at the time, I was a bit like, about that. But my opponent then said something which totally changed my opinion on it. And I want this, for what I'm going to tell you, to totally change your opinion on it as well. Bear in mind, I know my opponent, by the way. I've played him several times before, and we get on fairly well. We're friends. Sounded very clinical, that. But my opponent said, if you want to play on top table, Tim, we're playing on top table. And it clicked. We're on a tournament. I might be having a fun game and be a bit like, oh yeah, I'm playing Scions, and it hadn't clicked with me. We're on top table. Whoever wins this, game 2, might win the tournament. My opponent was playing to win, and I was playing, I was playing too casually. And when you're at an event and you're playing to win, you need to play to win. And I was like, ah, and it was like a lightning bolt hit my head. I had almost been taking it too casually. And if you want to play on top table, if your opponent makes a mistake, then your opponent makes a mistake, and it's okay to capitalize on that. So, fair play. I shouldn't have rolled the dice, and I had moved the model, and it was just stupid. It was just totally. It was a mistake on my end, and my opponent was able to capitalize it. And if I had managed to, if I hadn't done that, I would have won the game. So that was why I lost the game. I made the mistake. And I also would want to say that another thing that was, I would say that was a problem that I made was, and this really showed the issues with the Valkyries as well. Okay, so I take the Valkyries to fly in and precision drop and blow something up, but every time I've tried to do that, I've failed. Okay, and in this game, I flew in and tried to precision drop. He had a couple of the Las chickens, and I was like, I won't kill a knight in one turn, but I definitely want to kill those Las chickens because they're a nightmare. So I flew in, dropped 4 Melta guns with elimination protocol sanctioned on them, and I only killed one of the chickens. I just rolled terribly. My opponent rolled slightly well for his saves. And every single time I've done this, in every game that I've done this, when I've flown in, precision dropped and blown something up, every time I've done it, turn 1, I have lost the game. Every single time. And it's made me realise that every single time that I've played cagey with my Valkyries, like in game 1 of this event, I've smashed it. Absolutely smashed it. So I think I'm going to change. I don't think I'm going to be doing that precision drop Melta thing anymore. That definitely has given me something to think about. So I lost that game basically because I played badly. I played it not cagey enough. The terrain made it almost impossible for me to hide from knights because they're so big. And I made a stupid mistake. And that's why I lost my game too. So, but it was very close. Like, what, 1 point in it? Next to nothing. Next to nothing. So it was a very close loss. But yeah, that was game 2. So now it's time for game 3 and then the wrap up to the event. So game 3 rolls around and I am facing off against an Iron Hounds Dreadnought list. And this, guys, is a really, really good list. Essentially, it relies on taking 2 Volkite Contemptor Dreadnoughts, one of which is a character which the Iron Hands can awaken a character Dreadnought like every turn or something crazy, and it goes like Super Saiyan. So he had 2 of those, and he had 2 Redemptor Dreadnoughts, one with Plasma and one with Mega Gatling, some Vanguard Veterans, and then a whole bunch of like regular infantry, like incursors. I want to call them incursors. 2 attack bikes with multi-melter, and 2 squads of Inceptor jumpy dudes, or I think it might have been 1 big squad that was combat squadded. But again, so that was the list. Really, really good opponent. Probably say my last game of the day was probably one of my favourite games because it was just a really fun game. Both of us knew we weren't in the running for podium, so we just did a good one. And one thing I do want to say though, and it's the last time I'm going to mention it, look at this terrain. Plenty of ruins in each deployment zone, but that is a killing zone in the middle of the board. Okay, absolute killing zone. Oh, my opponent had eradicators as well, I should have said. And those 2 green like rubble rock things sticking out, they're just like area terrain. You just go in them for like a +1 to your save, that was it. So there's only 1 small-ish ruin of line of sight blocking in the middle, and the rest of it was horrendous. So the problem is that going first in this tournament was actually a disadvantage. Because if you went first, then basically you ran out and exposed yourself to try and do some damage, or you stayed back. But if you went first, if you ran out, you did some damage, but then your opponent just killed you, which is what happened in my second game, and it's what I did to my opponent in my first game. So in this one, I was like, okay, let's try and play it cagey. But I do want to eliminate his eradicators, because my opponent had some eliminators as well. I do want to eradicate his eradicators with because they are a real threat to my Taurox Primes. So I played it cagey with everything, but apart from one unit where I flew forward with the 10-man plasma squad, dropped down, and reroll ones to wound. My opponent did transhuman, it didn't help, and I absolutely mashed his 4-man eliminator squad. Just absolutely mashed it and killed all 4 of them in one go. And that was really good. But that was kind of like... And then I killed 5 of his incursors as well. And my opponent was like, wow, that was a really strong turn 1. But then... that was kind of it. And it was really difficult. I moved for... Oh, I should say, I took Rod and Engage, and I didn't fit. I maxed out Rod this time. And I did really well on Engage this time. But my third secondary, I took Psychic Ritual, or whatever it was, the one where you do it in the middle of the board and you get points for it cumulatively. Warp Ritual. And so I moved my Bullgryns up to the middle and I started Warp Ritualing. I did manage to max out, which was really, really good. But the problem was actually primary in this game, because you had to hold 2 to get 5 points. The mission was Overrun, I believe it's called. Yeah, game 3 was Overrun. So what happened was my opponent had screened his dreadnoughts so I couldn't precise drop them. And I couldn't come out and expose myself to kill the dreadnoughts without basically risking just getting swept away. And so I played it, I think I made a mistake here, I played it too cagey. Now what happened was essentially I did really, really well on the secondaries, but did poorly on primary. I got 10 points, 10 points, and then 5 points and 5 points. I actually denied my opponent getting any primary on turn 4. He got 10 points, then none turn 4. But then turn 5, he maxed it out. So even though I'd done a really good last hurrah, my opponent maxed out his primary, and he then did not maxed out primary. He got 35 on primary, and then he got a little bit more on secondary. Just it was pretty close. But the end results, I think my opponent won by basically 10 points. But the problem was that I just couldn't move out. I couldn't move out because I couldn't overwhelm anything. I deployed Taurox. I'd spread myself out a little thin in an attempt to try and cover up more of the objectives. But the problem really here, guys, came down to the fact that Valkyries, you can't hide them. And if there's not enough terrain to hide your Taurox Primes either, then it was a bit of a shooting gallery, really. And the big problem here was those Volkite Contemptor Dreadnoughts. They've got such good range, and they've also got fantastic mortal wound output, which meant that my opponent was able to pretty quickly rinse through my Bullgryns in a turn, or a turn or 2. And then I'd done some damage, and I'd killed nearly pretty much killed all his infantry and all the surrounding stuff. But the fact that I couldn't get near his dreadnoughts, I couldn't drop in against them. I think in hindsight, guys, if I'm going to be totally honest, I should have seen this terrain and gone, right, I need to load up on one side of the board. But the problem was, if you look at the terrain here, my opponent put all his dreadnoughts and everything in the big ruin on the right hand side. From my perspective, again, this is from my perspective. So that big sort of black and gold one, and I only had that big tall grey ruin, but you can't hide anything in that. It's not big enough. And I had that yellow one which I could hide a bit in, but I didn't have enough on that side of the board to hide in, which meant that if I should have played it cagey and let him move out and then got the drop on him. But the problem was I couldn't have hidden anything. I couldn't have hidden it. But I think I was overly cagey. I think I should have... it's because Scions are so fragile, but what I should have done is totally overloaded one side of the board and gone forward, taken a bit of a beating turn 2, turn 1, and then just smashed it. If I got rid of those dreadnoughts, I reckon it would have been a different game, because then he would have been struggling to deal with the Bullgryns. So that was my mistake. So I think I lost game. I'd say that I lost game 2 and game 3 because my opponents could outgun me on boards which didn't have enough terrain. That's factor number 1. Definitely not the only factor. I think I played very poorly in my game 2 as well. And in my game 3, I think I played it too cagey. Maybe I was a bit hesitant coming off a loss, and not knowing what my opponent's list could do. But I certainly felt like I lost both of my games primarily because of the mistakes that I had made, and those mistakes were compounded, or my choices were influenced a little bit by being overly paranoid about the terrain. That would be kind of how I would describe it. So that was the event. Unfortunately, I went 1-2, so 1 win, 2 losses, but one of my losses was obviously very close, and both of my losses were pretty close. But I had actually scored really, really highly in all of my games. I think, I got 96 in the first game, and then I got in the high 60s in both of my other games. So yeah, really, high scoring. And because of that, even though I'd only won one game, I actually ended up coming 15th out of 32, which is, just squeaked into the top half, basically, halfway. And what's interestingly, I scored the highest out of everyone who had 1 win, 2 losses. Or maybe it was out of 30 players. I was basically bang on the middle. But interestingly, if you added up my points, how much I physically scored, I actually came, just purely on game points, I came 11th. So that gives you an idea of how that 96 win was really, really good. In terms of analysis of the event, I think that I did. There's a tactic you can do at events called submarining, where you lose your first game, but just by a little bit, so that you then get easier game 2 and 3. I think I Zeppelined, where I scored too highly and then exploded in a fireball, and I suffered from it. And I have had that happen to me before. But I don't like, I don't like trying to sort of win a game but not by enough. If I'm going to go in, I'm going to try and win. I'm going to go to tournament. I'm going to do the best that I can. And that's what happens. Sometimes you pay for it though. But there are some tactics around that, between submarining and whatnot. And other things to say in terms of the games, like I said, I've talked about. I think I made mistakes. I am never going to forget. I always forget Rod. I always forget to do it turn 1. I'm never going to forget Rod turn 1 ever again. It lost me a game. I could have gone 2-1. Who knows what I would have faced game 3? Who knows? I could have won all 3. But my stupid mistakes caused me to lose a game, which then caused me to lose my 3rd game. So I'm never going to forget Rod again. I would also say that I'm starting to become disenfranchised somewhat with the Valkyries and with the Bullgryns. The Valkyries are really useful, but I'm taking them to Melta precision drop. Every game that I do it, either the luck goes badly, my opponent luck goes well, or it doesn't pull off, or I get screened out even with a 5-inch drop. And so they're not really fulfilling their purpose, and they're more expensive than a Taurox Prime. What I find them actually good for is hanging back, hover mode, and then get, later turns zipping forward and doing stuff. But I don't think that they do that any better than a Taurox Prime or someone just deep striking in, So I'm really thinking that the Valkyries, I might drop both, I might keep one, not sure. The Bullgryns are a really interesting one. Every time that I use them, they have some games where they absolutely dominate, but then they have some games where they're just so easily countered. And the problem is the games that they're easily countered are the ones where I start coming across more top tier stuff. So I would describe them as like a bully unit. They're really good at laying the smack down on sort of mid-tier armies, but not the top tier. Drukhari, deal with them. Admech, destroy them. Volkite Dreadnoughts, absolutely blast them to death. And that's the thing. So, and this is what I would say I've found with this list in general. It is really good. It is a really, really strong semi-competitive list. And it is really, really good at punching down, or punching across. So anyone that turns up with a normal take all comers list, not top tier, it absolutely beasts it. And Scions are really good at bullying people. But the moment that these guys come across something that's got the real stones that can hold its own, they just collapse. They totally collapse. So I think I need to just be like, what stands out in this list every game is the Taurox Primes. Every single time. What stands out in this list is that I don't have enough deep strikers every single time. So I think I'm going to consider going pure Scions, and I mean pure. Taurox Primes and Command Squads and Tempestor Prime and Tempestor Squads, and that's it. That's what I'm thinking. Really lean into the Taurox Prime and Scions spam and make a bit of a skew list, but a good one. So that's really, really what I'm thinking. Hotshot volley guns always perform fantastically as well. Another thing that I want to say, last but certainly not least, is I really feel like this list I do very well when I face a list that I've faced before. But when I face something against the unknown, I tend to lose for the first time. But then when I face it a second time, I know what it can do, and then I can beat it. And I think that's really that's just true with Scions, because you can't really afford to make a mistake with them. So, but when you don't know necessarily what your opponent can do 100% inside and out, it means you're more likely to make a mistake. That certainly, I'd say, was the case for the third game. Why I lost the third one, I didn't know exactly what my opponent could do, and so I hesitated. I choked. He's choking now. That's what happened. So, if I was to revise the list, I'm going to look at more Taurox Primes. I'm going to look at more infantry. I'm going to look at taking advantage of deep striking the crap out of people. That's what I am thinking. Let's see if it pays off. Let me know what you guys think I could have done better. Let me know what you think of the list. Really open suggestions. Has anyone tried any Taurox Prime spam stuff? We're really interested to know how it's performed. One thing I would say that I'm really interested in, I've seen a mixed guard list do the rounds and do really well, and it's a list that takes like some Tempestor Prime, some Taurox Primes with Scions, and then it takes some regular infantry just to like screen and do objectives, and it's like three tank commanders and manticores. And I think that's a really strong list, and I'm tempted to try it out. So where you basically take sort of 50% Scions, 50% regular guard. Yeah, I'm starting to think that could be the way to go. The only reason I don't like that list is it does give away like max vehicle killing secondaries, which I don't like. Whereas I think Scions has the potential to have no good picks. And that's one thing I would say that's really strong about this list is if your opponent doesn't have a good codex secondary, this list doesn't, apart from assassinate, this list doesn't make it easy for your opponent to get those points. And my opponents who did pick assassinate against this list scored very poorly on it, because I'm able to hide the guys, able to hide the characters. So there we go. Lessons learned. I will not forget Rod, and I'm going to tweak this list, and I think I'm going to take more mechanized, or more like motorized, I suppose, to Taurox Primes. I think that's the way to go. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know what you think down in the comment section below. Take the mick out of me for forgetting Rod. Like 3 turns in a row, whatever it was something stupid. Take the mick. I deserve it. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know what you think, and of course, I'll see you guys next time.